From New York to our television and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. I'm David Weston. Let's check in on the markets. Abigail Doolittle, I don't know what's going on. This swing now. Yesterday it was all about tech. Today it's all about energy. What is happening?
It really is pretty amazing, David, that these big moves that we're seeing in all sorts of directions relative to sectors, cap size, along with style. So yesterday, of course, we had that huge monster rally for tech out of nowhere after last week. There was a drop. And then today we have tech lower, while, yes, energy up nearly 6%. It's really just incredible. So at this point, we have the S&P 500 up 0.5%. And what's very interesting here, yesterday up more than that, up 0.8%. Even though only 3 sectors were higher. Today, most sectors are actually higher, but we have a smaller gain because the weighting of those sectors, energy, materials, on down the board, less of a weighting to the S&P 500. The tech-heavy NASDAQ, on the other hand, down 0.8%. And this has everything to do with its 46% weighting to Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, and Google. So today we're really seeing that worst-case fear on the part of investors that if those names go down, it will take the markets. So to some degree, we're seeing that split, at least, between the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ. Small cap getting a bid, which did not happen yesterday, David.
So Abigail, speculate with me here. How much of this is sort of, forgive me, the real world? We have the big European bailout, fiscal bailout over there that was approved yesterday. We're talking even today about one here in the United States. Is it possible some of this is people reacting in stocks that would do well if there were a recovery?
You know, David, I think this has more to do with trading and technicals, quite frankly, because when you look at the rotations, we have these mini rotations going on day after day between, or week after week, I should say, between the different sectors in cap size and style. It doesn't really fit into one bucket or methodology, quite frankly, unless investors, one week they think, yes, recovery, and the next week, no, that is a possibility. Where we have some real euphoria out of the March low, David, is silver. It's pretty incredible, up 60%, gold lagging behind, but on the year, gold is leading. So it's not just stocks that are getting huge, this big rally out of the March lows on central bank liquidity. It's also these precious metals. It's going to be very interesting to see if this tremendous rally out of, again, the March low can happen cross asset class wise, or if we're going to see some sort of tapering of it this week, perhaps relative to stocks on earnings, David.
It is exciting on the equity side. By the way, bonds not so much. It's a little more boring over there. Thanks so much to Abigail Doolittle for that rundown on the markets. In the meantime, as we say, there are really negotiations begun in earnest today over a possible fiscal stimulus here in the United States as the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, meets with Secretary Steven Mnuchin of the Treasury Department. Let's turn now to David McIntosh. He's the president of Club for Growth for his take on what's going on with the stimulus. So, David, welcome back. Great to have you here. As you look at the issues, we all know what the issues are. What are the things that you think would be good for the economy, and what are you not so sure about?
Yeah, thank you, David. It's great to be with you. I think the key looking at this next round of federal legislation is what will keep the economy open and help businesses recover as it reopens. And frankly, just spending more stimulus money isn't going to do it, especially when it's spending money that goes to local and state governments. What's needed are some key policy changes. First, we have to protect people from the threat of trial lawyer lawsuits. The Senate's put that on the table, is very adamant about it. Second, Congress should authorize the president to continue waiving regulations and red tape so that as a business, particularly small businesses, reopen, they're not going to be threatened with a huge regulatory burden. And then there's some areas, they haven't spent half the money that was appropriated earlier. So what they ought to do is reassign that to some of the areas where people do need help. They can extend the unemployment benefits, but correct it so they're not paying the $600 bonus so you make more not working than you make working, but correct the formula and then extend it by using the existing funds that they appropriated a month ago when they did round 3. That's what we've told them is the best for the economy. It will help ensure that businesses can get back on their feet, can start rehiring faster, and the recovery will happen sooner.
So, David, what about the direct payments? They're also talking about a renewal of the direct payments. They had $1,200 before. That's now basically been spent. Do you agree that that's really helped, for example, the rebound in retail sales in the United States?
I think it has helped in liquidity and giving people the cash to be able to do it. But frankly, better to use that money in stimulating jobs where people are making money directly from their employer and be able to spend based on that. And then better target the assistance to people who are out of jobs. That's the unemployment mechanism, so that they have the cash and the money available to keep going while they're looking for the new job. What you don't want to do is just continue every 2 or 3 months to send just cash payments that have no larger economic growth potential to them. So if we, instead of sending out the cash payments, if they focus on getting unemployment insurance corrected so that people are helped but not incentivized to stay away from work, then we can see the liquidity in the economy and people back to work and growth in those sectors.
David, what about keeping people in their jobs? I mean, there's a lot of reporting that if there is not some real support given to state and local governments, we're going to have a lot more layoffs. There already have been some, but governors are warning they're going to have to lay off a lot of people. And these are Republicans and Democrats who are warning that. Right.
So the states have in their control the ability to get the revenue through their taxes, right? If they continue to shut down where it's not needed, they're losing revenue, and so you don't want to create a disincentive for them to do the right thing for balancing, protecting people from the virus and reopening the economy. So I'm not very sympathetic to that claim by the governors and state and local. They have, most of the local governments that we've talked to have already received more money than they would expect to have gotten in revenue at 100% normal economy. They're just putting their hand out for more when they see an opportunity politically to do that. Or like California says, okay, we're going to start paying down the debt that we have and balancing our budget. The states really have in their control to deal with this. They don't have to lay people off. We see it as a typical scare tactic that state and local governments use. They get a budget squeeze, and instead of reducing the overhead that's not needed, they say, oh, we're going to take away fire and police, because they know that politically that's the most sensitive one. So I think it's a political argument, not in fact a big economic factor.
David, what about one particular aspect of state government that I don't think that much money has been spent on yet, and that is the schools. As everybody wants to get kids back to school if they can do it safely, everyone seems to agree that's going to take extra money. If you have the social distancing that's being recommended, you have some of the equipment that's necessary, it's going to cost money. Are you in favor of giving states some specific targeted efforts to really support the school systems?
Yeah, so great question. And we are in favor of money going to education. But instead of sending it to the schools, what we would propose is it's almost like these cash payments, but you direct it to parents. So you have a COVID emergency grant to every parent, depending on their situation, their need, maybe up to $10,000 per student. They can use it to send it to a private school if they've lost their job and they can't afford tuition, to send it to the local parochial school. They can use it to homeschool, or they can use it to assist in the public school system in tutors and things if the schools are shut down and not able to do it, or they're distance learning and their kids have difficulty with that. So yes, I think, and by the way, I'm told that they've only spent $195 million of the several billion that was already directed to education. So there's money in the system that hasn't been used yet. Use that and frankly convert it into this grant program to the parents, who can then use it for public school, they can use it for private, they can use it for homeschool.
Okay, David, thank you so much for joining us. Always a pleasure. It's David McIntosh. He's the president of the Club for Growth. Meanwhile, over on the other side of the Atlantic, Europe has now agreed to a €750 billion fiscal stimulus package. We're going to talk with Jacob Kierkegaard of the Peterson Institute. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. It is time now for First Word News, and for that we go to Mark Crumpton.
Thank you. The Justice Department is accusing 2 Chinese hackers of stealing hundreds of millions of dollars of trade secrets from companies across the world, and more recently targeting firms developing a vaccine for the coronavirus. Prosecutors say the hackers stole information they knew would be of interest to the Chinese government. The hackers allegedly targeted companies in 11 major nations, including the UK and Germany. In eastern China, breached levees have trapped more than 10,000 people as flooding worsens across much of the country. Floodwaters rose as high as 10 feet in some areas of Anhui province, and heavy rain is expected to continue for several more days. At least 141 people have died or gone missing in flooding since the beginning of June. More than 150,000 homes have been damaged. A panel of British lawmakers says the government actively avoided looking into Russian interference in the 2016 Brexit referendum. A report out today says it is, quote, astonishing that no one tried to protect the democratic process. Lawmakers called for a full inquiry. The UK government dismissed the findings. Russia denies interfering in any country's election. Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot is pushing back against President Trump's threat to send federal agents to put down unrest. On Twitter, Mayor Lightfoot said she would not allow it and, quote, I will do everything in my power to stop you, end quote. Twice in recent days, the president has said he wants more federal law enforcement officers sent to cities such as Chicago, Philadelphia, and New York, following the dispatch of Department of Homeland Security personnel to Portland, Oregon, ostensibly to protect federal property there. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. Well, European leaders reached an historic agreement on 750 billion euros of fiscal stimulus yesterday, but only after 5 days of tough negotiation. Welcome now, Jacob Kierkegaard. He is Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Jacob, welcome. Good to have you here. So I said it's historic. Is it right? And how big a deal is this for Europe? Europe, the project, if I can put it that way.
No, I mean, I think I would use the word historic because this is the first time the European Union, or the sort of institutional embodiment, if you like, of the European project, issues large amounts of common debt to solve a common problem. In this case, it will be about 750 billion euros. Some of it will then be given as grants to member states, some of it as loans. To deal with the post-pandemic economic recovery. That is a very big political taboo that has been broken. And perhaps more importantly, in the future, when the European Union is again hit by whatever crisis might affect it, leaders at that point in time is going to undoubtedly look at the playbook established in the last 5 days and could very well, in my opinion, choose to repeat it so that you don't have a full, fiscal union in the EU because of this, but you certainly have, in my opinion, the prospects of future crises being solved once again with more common debts. And that's a big deal for Europe going forward.
How much, if I can put it this way, diplomatic capital was used up in getting this done? We had, for example, the Netherlands, Prime Minister Rutte really digging in his heels on this. It seems to have been a pretty tough negotiation. Are people going to remember that in the future?
I think there's no doubt. I mean, in my opinion, the smaller frugal states led by the Netherlands, but including also the Scandinavian countries and Austria and others, I think they played a diplomatically not very clever hand, but they clearly chose for their own domestic political reasons to, they wanted to basically get more of their own money back, so to speak, rather than perhaps push for the money being spent on the right things. Because one of the unfortunate sort of consequences of this political sausage making was that you did keep the focus on the pandemic recovery, but you made other cuts to other parts of the longer-term EU budget, particularly regarding EU support for research and development and green technologies and these types of things, actually things that these countries typically say they care a lot about. So I think they sort of got themselves into a little bit of a corner, and I don't think there's any doubt that they're not going to have a lot of sympathy in a lot of other capitals in the next 6 to 12 months. But at the end of the day, the most important thing is that there was a deal. At the end of the day, the EU came together and moved forward.
So, Jacob, it sounds like it was clearly, at least potentially, very important for the European Union overall. How important is it for the European economy? Because when is this money actually going to hit the street? Back here in the United States, we've had our fiscal stimulus, and they got it out the door pretty quickly. It doesn't sound like the European, that 750 billion euros, is going to be kicking around Main Street over there very soon.
No, I mean, I think it's important to recognize that this deal is not, if you like, in among itself a macroeconomic game changer, so to speak. It's simply not big enough because, as you said, it is likely to be only able to disperse about 1% of GDP over the next 3 years. And that's not going to change the trajectory fundamentally, given the scope of the declines that we're going to have this year in GDP. But what the deal does do, in my opinion, is that it greatly expands the political space for the European Central Bank to keep up its very aggressive monetary stimulus and its very aggressive asset purchases. And those are the asset purchases that basically enables the individual member states, including, of course, Italy and others, in running very large deficits so that they, at the national level, can finance most of their own recovery, of course, with the quote-unquote side effect that a lot more of their national debt is going to end up on the ECB balance sheet. So there is a very important sort of implicit coordination here between fiscal and monetary authorities. And then there is also an important political signal that fundamentally, Italians now can see that being a member of the EU, you get hit by a pandemic, there is a degree of insurance policy. And I think that's also an important political signal to send to a place like Italy.
So who decides when this money gets dispersed and how it gets dispersed? And did the member states keep any sort of strings on it?
Yeah, I mean, this is where it gets very detailed and very murky and potentially quite problematic, in my opinion, because there is a provision in this agreement that individual national member states or their parliaments can basically put down a veto on dispersing the grant component of these money, which is $390 billion, to individual countries if they feel that the recipient country, basically hasn't done enough economic reforms to justify it. That is, I think, a potential recipe for a lot of ugly political mudslinging and posturing and these types of things, because you could easily imagine that there will be parties in the Dutch parliament basically saying this about Italy over the next 12 months or so. And if that were to happen, well, then you can be sure that Italy would object to other things, and then it would be sort of a tit for tat, and everybody would end up being blind, and not very much money would be dispersed. So this is the requirement of unanimity, or at least the ability of individual member states to block individual investment grants, is a potential, in my opinion, significant source of concern with regards to, ensuring that you get a relatively timely distribution of the money and that the money goes to the countries that really needs it the most.
Okay, thank you so very much to Jacob Kierkegaard of the Peterson Institute in Washington. Coming up later in this program, we're going to hear from Penny Pritzker. She's the former Commerce Secretary, also an advisor to Vice President Joe Biden on that new plan that Joe Biden is announcing this afternoon for $775 billion to be invested in child care and elderly care. That's coming up later in this program. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. It's time now for Stock of the Hour, and we're going to look at Halliburton because Halliburton, with so many other energy stocks, is really up right now, apparently on the fiscal stimulus coming out of Europe and maybe some yet to come in the United States. Kaylee Alliance is here to explain it to us.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, David. Of course, a little bit of idiosyncrasy here with Halliburton as well because they reported second quarter results yesterday, largely taken positively by the market. Pretty significant EBITDA beat relative to expectations. Also on free cash flow, came in above $450 million. That was double street expectations, and their margins actually improved as well thanks to cost-cutting efforts. That helped offset the fact that revenue was down 37% sequentially because fracking in the shale patch essentially all but shut down. It actually got 2 analyst upgrades today, both from Bank of America and ATB Capital. So that is part of the reason that the stock is rallying for a second day now. But of course, David, as you alluded to, I could have picked any number of energy stocks to talk about today. They are far and away the leaders in today's session. The energy sector is up about 6%, widely outperforming the broader market, which is up just about 0.4%. Now, every single stock in the S&P Energy Index is positive on the day, and each of the top 10 performers in the S&P 500 is an energy stock. You see a number of them like ConocoPhillips. Occidental Petroleum, for its part, is up by about 12%. And of course, this is in part thanks to the rally we're seeing in oil. Both WTI and Brent crude prices up about 2.5% on optimism around that stimulus package in the EU, as well as talks resuming here for a next package in the U.S. that is aiding hopes about growth recovery, David.
Yeah, and Kaylee, just to push it a little farther, it's not just oil either. The commodities overall are up, aren't they?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. That idea that demand for commodities is going to pick back up, thanks in part to stimulus aiding the recovery, is aiding commodities across the commodity complex. The Bloomberg Commodity Spot Index is actually sitting at its highest since all the way back in on March 11th. So that really underscores the optimism about this recovery narrative that we're seeing, David. And I would point out, too, that it's not just energy, but other cyclical sectors like financials and industrials benefiting from that idea today, David.
So yesterday it was all tech. Today it's all the cyclicals. Wait till tomorrow. Who knows what it's going to be. Thanks so much to Kaylee Alliance for that report on Halliburton in the energy sector. In the meantime, coming up here, we're going to be talking about that U.S. criminally charging 2 Chinese hackers with stealing some research into the COVID-19 virus. We're going to be joined by James Lewis of CSIS, who's a specialist in this. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston, and it's time now for First Word News. And for that, we go to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. The Justice Department is accusing 2 Chinese hackers of stealing hundreds of millions of dollars of trade secrets from companies around the world, and more recently, targeting firms developing a vaccine for the coronavirus. Prosecutors say the hackers stole information with the help of the Chinese government.
China is providing a safe haven for criminal hackers who, as in this case, are hacking in part for their own personal gain, but willing to help the state and on call to do so.
The hackers allegedly targeted companies in 11 nations, including the UK and Germany. And David Weston will have more on this story coming up in a few moments. The Pentagon's considering changing its military presence in South Korea and around the world. Defense Secretary Mark Esper says the United States is turning more of its focus to China. Secretary Esper says he also favors having troops rotate their deployments as opposed to being permanently stationed somewhere. The U.S. has about 28,000 troops stationed in South Korea as a defense against North Korea. Joe Biden has unveiled a $775 billion plan to improve child care and care for the elderly. It would be paid for in part by taxes on real estate investors with incomes of more than $400,000 annually. The Democratic presidential nominee, the presumptive nominee, also would increase tax compliance by high-income earners. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. Well, just as Mark was speaking, we had one more headline cross. The FAA reportedly has reached an important milestone toward the Boeing 737 MAX approval. We'll continue to follow that as that story develops. But right now, I want to come back to the story Mark was talking about, and that is the accusation of Chinese hacking of intellectual property. The Trump administration, from the beginning, has made a priority of really trying to protect our cyber world from China, whether it is hacking or it's theft of intellectual property or it's competition in 5G. Welcome now a true expert in this area. He is Mr. James Lewis. He's the director of the Technology Policy Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Welcome, James. It's great to have you with us. Let's take up first this report just today, the Justice Department accusing some two Chinese hackers. What do you make of that story?
Justice has decided to push back hard against the Chinese. This espionage has been going on for probably about 20 years, and the Chinese have ratcheted up. They're dependent on stealing technology. And beginning in about 2015, the U.S. started to push back. So this administration has been harder than any other, though. And it's not a surprise. There's dozens of incidents like this where you catch Chinese spies trying to steal intellectual property.
Do we have a comprehensive policy to defend ourselves against it? Is it possible to have such a policy?
It is possible to have such a policy, and I think that's where we are headed. You need to put together a package of things: sanctions, indictments, expelling people, working with allies to build a common approach to China. The Chinese are not going to stop doing this, in part because it's one of the secrets to their economic growth. And this goes back to the 20th century, the idea that China needs to steal intellectual property. We've only just started to put together policies that push back on that. The Obama administration reached an agreement with the Chinese in 2015 that each side would stop using government actors to engage in commercial espionage. The agreement lasted about a year, a little longer, and then the Chinese walked away from it. So what we saw today is a pretty consistent pattern. If you're a hacker in China, you don't get a vote. The Ministry of Public Safety will come to you and say, basically, work for the government or go to jail. So these hackers, they probably didn't need much encouragement, but China uses this system of both state hackers, what we would call spies, and these private individuals, criminals, who act as proxies for the state. Long-standing story. Expect to see more indictments like this in the future.
James, you took me right to one of the questions that I have, which is, can we do this alone? President Trump, as you say, has identified that it's been tougher than other administrations has been. At the same time, he tends to like to do things on a bilateral basis rather than multilateral. Can we really effectively curtail Chinese abuse of cyberspace without our allies?
No, you need a concerted approach. And the thing that's interesting is that the Japanese, the Australians, they're pretty much there. The Brits are pretty much there. The Germans still a little bit on the fence. China's their biggest market, and they don't want to alienate them, but a huge debate in Germany. European Union and Brussels moving in our direction. So if we pulled all this together, you'd have a strong front against China. The Chinese worry about that. They worry that maybe we'll figure out that having allies is a good idea. So until we do that, it won't be as powerful a response. But the pieces are all there. We just have to decide to put them together.
James, also in the news today is Secretary of State Mike Pompeo visiting the UK, in part at least to address the issue of Huawei and the use of Huawei's 5G equipment. Give us a sense of where that is. That is, again, one of the things that President Trump has really emphasized. Are we in a race or even a battle with China over 5G technology?
Well, the 5G issue in Huawei gets back to Chinese espionage because Huawei has been cooperative, so it is alleged, with the Chinese intelligence agencies, and there's pretty good information on that. So when you approach Chinese espionage, you're also talking about Huawei and you're talking about 5G. And some people call this a victory lap for Secretary Pompeo. He's going because the Brits changed their mind and said they didn't want Huawei in their systems. Now, some of that was U.S. pressure, without a doubt. But you've got this real risk that many Europeans are concerned about, that China intends to steal their intellectual property, build competing industries, and put them out of business. So Huawei is part of this larger debate. 5G is going to be the way that networks are constructed in the future. People will need to figure out how to make money from them. But if you depend on a Chinese supplier, there is some risk that you'll end up being spied on. So it's it's kind of like the change we saw when people moved to the internet. You know, you have digital networks, all kinds of activities are now possible that weren't before. That's the future of 5G. But the question is, will you be dependent on China or on Western suppliers? And countries are slowly coming to the point of view that it's better to be dependent on the West. China's not going to go down easy on this one, though. The Chinese told Angela Merkel in Germany, if you ban Huawei, we will stop buying German cars. It's Germany's biggest market. They can't afford that. So this is a tough fight. It gets back to your question on allies. Go ahead.
Yeah, that was just my question. I mean, the UK is one thing. What about Germany when it comes to Huawei and 5G?
The Germans are on the fence. There's really an intense debate. Having talked to both the Minister of Economics, who thinks they should buy from Huawei, and to the head of the German intelligence service, who shares all the concerns we have about using Huawei, you don't have a common position, and it ends up being Merkel's decision. She's done what I would call the right thing. She's stalled, right? But the Germans are on the fence.
Okay, James, really appreciate you being with us. James Lewis of CSIS. Coming up next, we're going to talk with Penny Pritzker, former Commerce Secretary, about this new plan from Vice President Biden about child care and elderly care. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Later this afternoon, Vice President Biden is going to announce a planned $75 billion plan for elderly care and child care. I talked earlier today with Penny Pritzker, former Commerce Secretary, also an advisor to Vice President Biden, about what this plan would accomplish.
What Joe Biden will be is he will be a good jobs president, and he's going to provide greater certainty and stability in our economy, both domestically and internationally. And his proposal today is just one piece of that puzzle. He's really presented a Build Back Better plan for America, recognizing that we have too much income and wealth disparity in this country. And so the plan that he's offered today, which is the third pillar of his economic plan, is really focused on investments in child care and elderly care, helping Americans be able to go to work, making sure that they have a safe place for their children and for their elderly parents.
How many jobs are we talking about?
Oh, millions of jobs. I think the estimate is about 3 million jobs just for this part of his proposal. He's also made proposals around manufacturing and innovation, as well as infrastructure and investing in the green climate economy. And all of those have millions of jobs associated with them. So, Joe Biden is really focused on making sure that we all get back to work and that we get back to work in good jobs.
And what will this do as a practical matter for parents around the country? Take the child care first. Is this universal pre-K?
Yes, he's focused on making sure that you not only have access to daycare, but also to make sure that every child has access to universal pre-K, which we all know, every study shows that children who get that kind of head start, if you will, have a better opportunity in their education. And so this is just a practical plan to put America on good footing and to help all Americans.
Will this be a federal program administered at the federal level, or will this be by way of block grants and delegated to states?
You know, the specifics of exactly how it's structured will be worked out in Congress. But, mostly education is handled at the state level, the specifics of it. But, governors welcome this. I have yet to meet a governor who doesn't say, I want to be able to offer more care, more education options for the families in their state. So this is going to be a welcome program by, across the country.
And particularly right now, given the pandemic and the problems people have with their children at home.
The horrific situation that's facing our country. We have, the pandemic. We have now an economic crisis. We have a real realization of the racial injustice that we've been suffering as a country. And we need to stand up to all three of these crises and issues that are facing us. And Joe Biden's the right guy to do it. And he's proposing plans that are very practical, that are stable, that are reliable, so that, you know, if whether you're someone in the workforce, you're a business leader, you're in a not-for-profit, you know how to plan. I mean, we've been careening from, you know, one idea to another idea with our current administration. And what Joe Biden is saying is, I'm going to lay out a well-thought-out plan. I'm going to stick to what I want to get done. And you can rely upon that, both whether you're in our country or you're our allies.
At the same time, they don't come cheap. Any of these three planks have price tags attached to them. This one is $775 billion. How would that be paid for?
Well, first of all, folks like myself are going to have to pay more in taxes. But, you know, there's also the ability to, you know, look at restructuring incentives so that folks can be able to take deductions, if you will, to be able to afford the kind of daycare or childcare or elderly care that we're talking about. So it's a mix of programs that will be able to pay for this. It's absolutely doable. These are not outrageous numbers. These are completely within the realm of possibility in terms of structuring our both our tax and our revenue plans for our country.
This third plank, as I understand it, particularly will raise some revenue from commercial real estate investment, change some of the tax treatment, for example, like-kind exchanges, things like that. You and your family have had a fair experience with commercial real estate, and commercial real estate right now is under some stress because of the pandemic and the aftermath of that. What will be the effect on commercial real estate, on prices, on the markets?
You know, the most important thing in commercial real estate is to have a sound economy. If you think about commercial real estate, what do? We house the economy. And so to have a strong economy is what will actually drive value within the real estate market. The fact that we have a very weak economy, we have huge unemployment, we have great uncertainty, that's the problem for the commercial real estate business, not, you know, particular proposals by Joe Biden.
Do you anticipate with your friends and colleagues who invest in commercial real estate that they will buy that, or are they going to resist this?
Look, every special interest has their own, you know, focus, if you will, but that's not the point. This is the time when the country needs to come together and recognize we have to build a better economy for our country, one that's durable and sustainable, one that works for all Americans. And folks in commercial real estate, folks in business, folks in leadership around our country recognize that that's essential. We can no longer live with this kind of massive disparity that we have. We can no longer have a situation where healthcare doesn't take care of every American. We can no longer have a situation where Americans have no idea how they're going to be able to go to work or to get an education or to be prepared for the jobs of the future. I mean, that's the other thing that Joe Biden's very focused on, is helping Americans be prepared for today's jobs and jobs of the future. And you'll hear more about that in the coming weeks in terms of upskilling, and something that I'm very focused on, which is making sure that we have the kind of training that we need in this country to be competitive. That's more important than any particular, you know, modification in a specific tax policy.
Even apart from tax policy, as I say, commercial real estate is under some stress right now because of the pandemic. Whether it's office towers or whether it's malls, we're really having some big questions. From your experience in this area, commercial real estate, what kind of long-term changes do you think we're going to be seeing in that market?
Well, what I'm hearing is that you know, companies are rethinking what they're going to need in terms of their office real estate footprint. They're recognizing that they can do more work from home. We've all learned to become much more technologically savvy. That doesn't mean it's to the exclusion of having offices, but I think you're going to see shifts and see what I hear among my peers in the CEO community. They're thinking about what their workforce is telling them they want and need. And so I think you're going to see shifts in demand. I do think that our center cities will remain places of great interest and great demand. I think once we can get back to a healthy environment and a situation where we're not having to stay at home, I think that you'll see a vibrant economy in our major cities and in our commercial real estate. As it relates to retail, retail's been going through a change, and the pandemic has hastened that in terms of how much we rely on e-commerce. But this is something that, one of the things that folks in commercial real estate learn to do is to adapt their properties. And I think you're going to see change coming.
More broadly, we have a little over 3 months to go now until the election, and we all see the polls. It's still a long way to the election. But right now, the polls are indicating that Joe Biden may well be the next president of the United States. And markets are starting to take that seriously. CEOs are. The CEOs you talk to, what do you tell them about what a Biden presidency will mean for business, for the financial markets? Because there's a lot of concern about taxes and regulation.
I think what a Joe Biden presidency will mean, first of all, is stability and certainty. And that's the first thing that American business leaders want to know. What's the circumstance? It is, if I've talked to one, I've talked to dozens of my business leader friends who are saying, I don't know how to plan because I can't tell what to expect because I don't know, what are the rules, and they keep changing, and what's the circumstance they're facing. So certainty is number one, and I think most important. The second is our relationship around the world. Whether we like it or not, we live in a globalized world. And that means we both do business around the world. We have to work with our allies. It's extremely important that we participate as a country in the major issues facing our planet, like climate change.
Former Commerce Secretary Penny Pritzker. This is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Unidentified federal agents have been showing up in Portland, Oregon in the demonstrations out there, doing what appears to be police work. And now President Trump says he may do that in other cities like Chicago and New York and Baltimore. Welcome now Josh Wingrove, who covers the White House for Bloomberg. So Josh, what is going on?
So the federal government has the power to protect federal buildings, and they're essentially using that as kind of almost a Trojan horse, if you will, to force officials into Portland to guard the courthouse there, which has been the site of much of these rolling protests, or which had elements of rioting in them over the course of the last 50-something days since the death of George Floyd. So essentially, they're pulling people from DHS, border guards, that kind of thing, and making them into essentially courthouse guards, and they have the power to sort of, defend the courthouse and arrest people who try to damage it. The question is how far they can go. If they see someone, throw a can of paint on the courthouse, it looks like they're chasing them through the city and arresting them and detaining them. So this has, of course, raised questions about whether Fourth Amendment rights are being violated. Some people are being detained without charge. They're not particularly identifying themselves, driving in unmarked cars. So, the scenes are quite striking and, of course, evoke scenes that you wouldn't really normally associate with a democracy. But it is sort of part and parcel with the president's ongoing contrasting of what he tries to portray as sort of lawlessness in cities, Democrat lawlessness, against his push for law and order. So he's really leaning into this. And as you say, we expect Chicago and other cities to be next, although they could be a little bit different. In those cases, it wouldn't necessarily be protecting a courthouse. They might try to team up more with law enforcement.
One of the things, Josh, we generally want, and particularly right now in the wake of the George Floyd killing, is some accountability by the people who are policing us. Who is responsible for this? I mean, if it were really marshals protecting the courthouse, presumably that would be the Justice Department. On the other hand, if they're prison guards, as I'm told were used at one point in Washington, that might be the Department of Homeland Security. Who's in charge?
I mean, it looks to be mostly DHS, but we don't really know. I mean, this is opaque by its very nature, and they're within their rights to do it. Remember, the federal government has in the past talk about school integration, that kind of thing. Like, the feds have the power to sort of impose things on states that don't want them. But make no mistake, the mayor and governor in Portland and in Oregon say they don't want the feds to be doing what they're doing. They say that they're making them worse, whereas the federal government says you're not stopping these protests. we're going to do something about it if you aren't. Now, of course, President Trump, controversial figure, Oregon, a blue state, it sort of presents almost a perfect test case for him to do this, to send in these troops, because it's sort of got a culture of protesting there. These protests really aren't going to go away. But yes, it's remarkable. I mean, President Trump 4 years ago was running on building a wall with on the Mexican border, and now he's pulling border guards in to police a courthouse in Portland. It's a pretty stark shift.
And the Chicago mayor just today said she doesn't want to go on in Chicago. So it's a fascinating story. Thank you so much to Josh Wingrove, who covers the White House for Bloomberg. Coming up on the second hour Balance of Power on the radio, we're going to take up the question of Judy Shelton and her nomination for the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. That's going to be coming up in a Senate vote later on this afternoon. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg.